1C says to write each expression in simplest form. This question is very similar to 1A, and the only difference is that the 1C has a number in the front of the square root, whereas the problem in 1A was just simplifying the square root. So you're going to approach this in a very similar way. For now, I'm going to just ignore that 3 in the front, and I'm going to really just focus on the square root of 48. But at the end, I'm going to multiply whatever I get by that 3 that's in the front. So again, you're going to look for some factors of 48. You want to look at your perfect squares and pick the largest perfect square that divides evenly into 48. So 16 times 3 is 48, and you could write that as the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. The square root of 16 is 4. And the square root of 3 you don't know, so you would leave it as the square root of 3. Now, you might not recognize right away that 16 divides evenly into 48. It's not necessarily a factor that we all have it like right ready in our brain. So you might have picked 4 to start with. If you did that, you could have done 4 times 12. And then you would make that the square root of 4 times the square root of 12, and the square root of 4 is 2 times the square root of 12. But you need to think about that square root of 12 and say, okay, it's square root of 12. There's still a perfect square, 4, that goes into 12. So you could repeat the process again, and you could write this as the square root of 4 times the square root of 3, and the square root of 4 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 square roots of 3. So obviously, by far the most efficient way is if you recognize the largest perfect square right away. But if you don't, you want to just make sure you keep going so that at the end, whatever's underneath your square root sign, you look at that and you realize that there's no perfect square that divides evenly into that number. All right, so this is what we've done for the square root of 48. But what about that 3 in the front? Well, it's really easy. You're just going to make that 3 times and then replace the square root of 48 with 4 times the square root of 3, which would then simplify. You would just multiply 4 times 3, and that's going to give you 12 square roots of 3, and that is your final answer.